In this video, I'll explain why, as a prepper, I decided to move out of the city and into the country, so stick around. If you've watched my channel for any amount of time, you realize, obviously, that I no longer live in the city. I've moved out into the country. And when I started the channel, I started with the name City Prepping because, obviously, I lived in the city. But as I began to study prepping, as I began to look down the road a little to where I wanted to be in, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, etc., I began to realize that I wasn't going to be able to do what I wanted to do as a prepper in the city. Now, does that mean that if you're in the city, if you're in a suburban environment or urban environment, that prepping is a waste of time? No, I do not believe that at all. I believe that even if there was a true grid down scenario, that people in the city, in a suburban environment, I believe they could survive. But there are going to be some really huge challenges, especially if you have not developed a community to work with you. On that note, I began to look down a little further, and I realized that there were skills I wanted to develop, things I wanted to learn, and I felt constricted really in the environment that I was in. So when I look at things, I typically look from a short-term perspective and a long-term. From the short-term perspective, from a prepper's perspective, I realized there were some major challenges. Number one, I live in Southern California. I share this a lot in my videos. And we're always being warned that the big one is coming, that there's going to be a massive earthquake, and we're constantly being warned by city officials to prepare. And a lot of people don't because they've been hearing that message for so long. And I realized, look, if that were to really happen in my lifetime, and again, based on a statistical probability in my lifetime, it's very highly probable I'll see that. I begin to realize, look, I need to be out of a tight environment. And so when I look at prepping, that was one of the first things that really caught my eye, was the reality is I live in an environment that's, probably eventually going to have an extremely bad earthquake. The second thing that really concerns me is, again, I've shared this in the past, my background is microbiology. And even back in the late 90s when I was studying, one of the concerns was a superbug, some type of antibiotic resistant pathogen that would eventually hit the scene, that they would not be able to solve the problem of how to cure it. We're already seeing different versions of that already hitting around the world. A lot of those things have to be contained really quickly. If not, then, if it were to spread into, society as a large, it'd be game over. And as I began to look at that, I realized, look, that is a huge potential problem, and I just did not want to be in a very compact environment with a lot of people. The third thing that I began to look at, again, from a short-term perspective, realizing it could be problematic, is our just-in-time food delivery system. If you've ever studied that and look at how the grocery stores are set up, everything is based on things arriving just in time. The typical store in America does no longer stocks a lot of inventory in their food supply. Things, as soon as you pull something off the shelf, there's a ticket that's created within their inventory system to order a new product, and that arrives usually within 24 to 48 hours. So it's a constant rotation that moves quickly. And so knowing all these things and looking at the vulnerability of our system, looking at the reality that probably within our lifetime we'll see some type of disease hit. Again, I'm not, trying to say it's absolutely going to happen, but it would not shock me. And again, realizing, living in Southern California, I'm in an environment that's prone to a very high probability of seeing an earthquake in my lifetime. Adding those three things up, I begin to realize, look, I need to be out of a condensed environment and by condensed, I mean with a high population density. Obviously, living in Southern California, we have an extremely high population density. But I was lucky enough to find some land out here. I'm on 5 acres that is still in Southern California. That I'm able to, for the most part, develop the land as I want. In the short year that I've lived here on this property, I've begun to really go after developing skills, namely gardening, raising bees, and water storage. I'm going to be putting in chickens here pretty soon. So I'm beginning to go after the skills that I want to learn for the long haul. Having listed out the short-term concerns I have as a prepper, the number one long-term concern I have is global warming. Now, I know this is a very controversial subject. A lot of people get upset when this is discussed. This subject, a lot of times people try to push it into the arena of politics, and it's something that a lot of people don't want to discuss, at least in a civil way. And again, my background. I've just shared earlier that I was studying microbiology when I was in college, and having gone through watching and observing the scientific process, scientific method of how we come to certain conclusions based on empirical data that's surrounding us. This is kind of a no-brainer. I don't know why a lot of people get upset about it, but when you're looking at the information and how it's being shown and the conclusions we're coming to, it gravely concerns me, because I have children that I want to make sure that they have a good future, that I would hate to see them live in a world that's not sustainable in 30, 40 years from now. Having said that, I'm not overly optimistic that the governments or the different agencies that make a lot of these decisions when it comes to carbon emissions, I'm just not overly encouraged that we're going to see this resolved anytime soon. As a parent, when I'm looking down the road and I'm evaluating the things that I can do to prepare my children to be successful, the reality is that the world that we're leaving behind for them is not exactly the same world that we had a few years ago. We're impacting our own environment at a very rapid pace with our own carbon emissions. Now, I know this particular subject upsets a lot of people when you talk about global warming and the evidence is put forth. A lot of people try to push this conversation into the arena of politics, and there's a lot of controversy that surrounds it. But for me, again, I mean, whether or not you agree with global warming, I'm not going to make this a big push on this channel. I do have a very, very big concern. I've studied this exhaustively. Again, my background is in science. I've looked at the data. I've looked at what the scientific community is pointing out and observing. And as a father, as a parent that's very concerned about the long-term, health of my own children, I want to make sure that I'm setting them up and preparing them for success. And that's why I've chosen to leave the city and develop land, because I want to learn how to be more self-sustaining in an environment like this. When my father was in town a couple of weeks ago, his parents lived through the Great Depression, and they had to learn how to garden. If they didn't, if they weren't good gardeners, they weren't going to be able to eat, and they weren't going to survive. And I think within 10 to 15 years, if we make it that long without something major happening, I think it's going to be very, very important to have skills, not just gear. A lot of time in the prepping community, we look at things from the perspective of, oh, I've got X, Y, and Z gear stored up, and that's good. That's absolutely advisable to have the proper gear, to have food inventory, to have things prepared. But I think skills at the end of the day are going to be extremely important. You can take a skill with you wherever you go. It's transferable. You can move with it. And gardening has been, one of the things that's on the forefront of my mind. And living in an urban environment, yes, you absolutely can garden. You can do that. There's people that have done amazing things in a small backyard. But I wanted the land to expand out to do a lot more projects, to develop things that maybe I couldn't in a small environment. So that's one of the primary reasons I decided to move out of the city, at least for a long-term perspective, is that I knew I needed to develop skills, and I wanted the land to do it. And I think in the future, especially as a prepper, land is going to be everything. Without land, it's going to be very, very challenging. Again, I think living in a suburban environment, urban environment is going to be possible, but I think it's going to be extremely, extremely challenging. There's going to be a lot of problems. When I began to look at land about a year and a half ago, I originally started looking at bug out locations, and there were a lot of things that came up, a lot of challenges. And that's why I decided, I'm just going to go ahead and buy land with a house on it and just go ahead and move to that, as opposed to having a particular bug out location that I could go to if things got bad. I don't regret the decision. I'm looking at a long-term picture here again of learning how to cultivate this land, learning skills, and I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. I've already been putting in garden beds, and I've actually made several mistakes already, but that's good. I'm learning, and pain and mistakes are a powerful tutor. And so, even as I shared in the video a couple of weeks ago, building the foundation for the water tank, that was a ridiculous project, but I learned a lot. And that's what really motivates me out here on this land, is to continue to learn. I try to spend a good amount of time every day getting out here, doing things, and having listed out these reasons. Again, if you live in a city or a suburban environment, I'm not saying it's impossible to make it, but it's definitely going to have challenges. And I think if you're really serious as a long-term prepper, you need to begin to look at an opportunity to invest in land where it's possible. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, your feedback in the comment section below. Again, I know I've introduced some elements into this video that probably will upset some people, and that was the intent. I'm sharing my reasons. You may have completely different reasons. And I'd be curious to hear your concerns if you list those out in the comment section. Again, I learned so much from the community, and I always enjoy getting your feedback. As always, be safe out there.